Thanks for inviting me to interview y'all for your thesis. Just for everyone else, my name is Scott Campbell. I'm a visual artist and curator based in Detroit and Chicago. I'm currently in Chicago now, where I'm also doing graduate studies at University of Chicago. But prior to that, I was a artist liaison for Readable Arts Detroit, in addition to kind of all of my own visual art careers and exhibitions, and also doing curatorial work outside of that. And I had the pleasure of curating the Syracuse graduate thesis a couple years ago. So this is a nice virtual homecoming. I don't know what you want to call it, but it's a pleasure. So I think just to start out, maybe if you two want to tell me a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your practice, and also why you decided on a joint interview. I know y'all were studio mates, but I'm just curious.
Okay, so I'll go ahead and go first. So my name's Katie. I am from Detroit originally, but went after high school, I moved to Louisiana and did my undergraduate studies at Louisiana State University. And I actually did dual degree in sculpture and psychology. And that actually, my studies in psychology really play into what I'm doing in the studio now. So I do mostly three-dimensional work. I have a heavy background in metal casting, but I'm now doing, a lot of other three-dimensional work. And so my main project right now is I am working on creating a living room where I'm taking found objects and kind of doing like a reverse color by number, where I'm tracing the patterns on the objects, painting them in white, so it becomes this three-dimensional coloring book image, essentially. So that's what I'm working on.
So as my name in the corner says, I'm Joshua Baker, third year MFA candidate at SU. Mostly I work in sculpture or three-dimensional objects. I've also done done a couple of experimental performances while I was here, and also used to do a lot of etching and woodblock printing and some drawing before this, but kind of transitioned into more three-dimensional sculptural work. Was born in Rochester, but grew up primarily in Maine, so I'm always that from away kid. I'll never actually get true Mainer in the eyes of Maine, but I like to think that I am. Did my undergrad at University of Maine, did the BFA dual major with art history background. And then, a lot of my work kind of transitioned into now, a lot of the stuff that I do has to do with a lot of kind of examining, going through a lot of anecdotes and personal experiences and stories and things that I grew up, that they're the kind of things that I was always really nerdy about hearing about the other stories, or especially on the campfires and things like that growing up, those kind of stories that you always get a little embellished, so they're never really true, and kind of a little bit of sarcasm and wit imbued into it. So I'm dealing with anecdotes now, and I don't want to speak necessarily for Katie, but I guess doing a joint interview, it just a lot of my work has to do with conversation anyway now, and communal storytelling and experiential stuff. But also I think Katie deals with a lot of similar issues of space, scale, and size. And I've always been usually I try and relate everything to be approximately a little larger than human scale, a little larger than sort of just on the cusp of being able to sort of imagine the physicality of the object that's in front of you, but kind of having it just a little out of reach. So I don't know if Katie wants to add anything to that too.
Yeah, definitely scale, size, but also there's a sense of family history. And Josh, in conversations we've had, he talks about these stories that, his father told him, that his grandfather has told him. And my work is, a lot of my work is rooted in experiences I've had with my grandmother as well. So there's that connection too, although it's, I think the tone of it is different, but there is that part that's sort of based in family history.
Well, definitely, I definitely see that in the work that I've seen that both of y'all sent me. And I guess one question that I had was, how important is that personal narrative to you in terms of coming across to the viewer? Do you view that personal narrative as really like the genesis point where you then try and broaden it and expand the work itself? Or are you interested really in driving that personal narrative across? Like if there couldn't be an artist statement with the work.
I know for me, when I'm making the work, like that personal narrative is like, that's in my head. There's no getting away from that. And that is that. I mean, I feel like that's essentially what I'm making the work about. But I do want it. I want the viewer to take from it what they're going to take from it. Yeah, I don't think, if there's not an artist statement, I don't think it's important for the viewer to look at it and immediately go like, oh, her grandmother must have been a hoarder. That's obvious from the work. Like, I don't need that moment to happen. I like that the viewer can interpret the work, can see the work as they're going to, and think about their own family history and how that could play into it.
But you would say the theme of family history coming through, that's important for you to get across, whether or not they know it's the particular family history that you're making the work about is less important for you. Am I understanding that?
Yeah. I'd say so. Yeah.
So it's more about that relationship, that familial relationship, and maybe the difficulties around those things.
Yeah.
And Josh, same question, Josh, because I feel like, especially with the works I've seen of yours that, are kind of have this humor about them. I'm like, humor functions in this really weird way that it can both make us feel closer to somebody, but also distance. And I feel that in your work, like in some pieces, it's pulling me in, and other places it's keeping me at a distance in a certain way. I find that very interesting. But yeah, similar kind of question, like what kind of themes do you want to come across to the viewer, and how much of that personal narrative is important for you to come across?
I would say similarly, like I think it's like important for me when I'm making work to have that sort of like personal narrative or background, but I'm not super, I don't need them to be able to look at that and be like, oh, I know the origin of that joke or story or like what's going on there per se. I think humor is a really powerful bonding element. And I think that like similarly to how like a lot of like those family histories and stories like bond, families together and people together, and like the family that you get and the family that you choose, how humor is kind of this sort of, I don't know, I feel like that's how I try to relate to everybody day to day. I have a really bad habit of incessantly telling jokes, both at the appropriate and inappropriate moments. I'm kind of the double down. I'm going to keep telling jokes until someone laughs or I'm kicked out of the room, to a bit of a fault. Sorry, everybody. But I think humor is just really like, it's how I try and like connect with people, and to say that like I'm paying attention by like responding in a witty way or like trying to connect with them, just make them laugh and sort of get through the day. And I think that instead of them necessarily knowing my family history, it's more trying to connect with them and just like bring them in with me and be closer with them through like humor is like this mediator, but kind of like trying to bring people together in that sense.
Would you say that your artistic practice functions in that similar kind of way? If you're using jokes, kind of, and humor in your interpersonal relationships as a way to bond, would you say that you view your artistic practice as a similar kind of method for engaging with the world, as a way to try and bring people into you?
Yeah. I would say that a lot of my humor, similar to how like a comedian's kind of like giving a unique perspective on how they're seeing the world, they're trying to make you laugh at something you wouldn't think about, or like think about something differently. I would say that a lot of my artwork is trying to kind of bring people in and sort of like show them like a different way of looking at something they may not, trying to kind of shift for better or worse, like think about differently, like something that I might take for granted every day, be it, language, be like a pineapple, or be it sort of like the idea of like labor, or how you get things, or how you perceive images. So
yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, like when I looked at both of your works, and I think I use my practice in a similar way, as a way to digest things, as opposed to, I don't get any didactic feelings from any of your work. And I say that as a compliment. I mean, like, some people really like didactic work. That's their thing, but, not me personally, but, I think also like this kind of idea of processing was interesting, kind of to look at it, the way it functions in both of your work. But Katie, I was particularly drawn by the whitewashing of the objects, because, and then with covering them all with the same pattern, there's this idea of erasure there, and not being able to see the boundaries of things, having those boundaries kind of blend together a little bit. And, I understood, like, from reading the artist statement, like, the connection to the coloring book. But I guess my question is kind of, how does that idea of erasure play in for you if we're talking about digesting emotions and memories and perhaps things that are more maybe difficult? Like, the idea of erasing those things could be read as antithetical. But I mean, it doesn't read that way in the work, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking about this kind of this blurring of reality. So it's on this threshold. It's not real, but it's not real. It's a real space, but there's something off about it that just doesn't feel right. And so it's removing that kind of solid grounding in reality and taking it somewhere else. And with the patterns, the way I see it as it progresses is that all these objects are going to start to kind of camouflage together. Like, I don't want harsh lighting on it to make shadows, and that will further push this idea of this uneasiness when you're looking at it, and it takes you a minute to realize kind of where one object ends and the other, begins. And it is. There's that sense of erasure of taking out, just taking out a certain level of comfort.
Yeah, I mean, it's, I found it to be a really just kind of interesting device that you were using. I couldn't tell, I think perhaps as an artist myself, you start to think about, like, how would my hand look in this? And you try not to do that as much as you can. But, it's funny, like, I was struck by this idea of reality versus non-reality, because I'm not really sure what non-reality is. And especially when we're talking about, would you say, like, you're dealing with themes of memory in this? Like, I know you're obviously talking about specific relationships and memories with specific people. But I guess, what do you mean by non-reality? Let's start there.
So it's kind of twofold. So growing up, I started to experience these bouts of dissociation, where it's a coping mechanism, but it's this state where you feel like you're outside your body, basically, and there's like emotional numbness involved, and it's like watching yourself on TV. So you're going through life, but there's this wall there that separates you, and that state is it's this kind of state of non-reality. It's you're on that kind of threshold between you're there but you're not there. And the second part goes back to my grandmother, who she was a hoarder, and actually all of my grandparents, actually, but mostly my work, I think about my paternal grandmother. But so she was a hoarder, and I was never allowed in her house growing up, and I wasn't allowed in in my other grandparents' house either. And so, I'd go through school and classmates would be like, oh, I spent the weekend at grandma's house. And it kind of like, wait, you're allowed to go to your grandparents' house? Like 4 or 5 years old, I was like, wait, like I thought people weren't allowed to go to their grandmother's houses. And so I kind of came up with this, this image in my head of what a grandparent's house would look like in a normal situation. So that's where a lot of these objects that I'm using in this installation are sort of rooted in this image I had of what this environment would look like. And so it could be a real living room, it could be a real place, but in my reality, it's not.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what intrigued me about that gesture, to kind of bring it full circle back to the whitewashing. It was interesting that, to hear you saying, like, I think the reason behind doing that, if I'm understanding you correctly, was this idea of just making it something like, comfortable but uncomfortable. Like you're trying to get at this idea of a split between reality and non-reality, but you're making everything the same. So and like I think it's a really successful tension. I mean, I think it's one of those things, if you described it with only words, you'd be like, that doesn't sound like it's working. But then when you see it visually, like, oh, it does give this weird split by making everything the same. I think that's like a really kind of interesting touch. And, I think I'm going to, from that, kind of go back to you, Josh. I mean, I think that's something that I saw in both of your works, where these interesting gestures or methods of working that sometimes seem counterintuitive to what I think your goal or drive is, but it still works. Even like the way that you like so you're talking about like labor in some of your work, Josh, but then having this kind of very lighthearted, pun. Even like the pun is a particular kind of joke too, that I think holds a certain amount of goofiness in it, and kind of, so like dealing with these serious topics, but then having a work like the pineapple tree that is like very much what it is. It is a pine apple tree, but then does all the, so that's like another one of the, like that, as I was reading that as like this similar kind of methodology. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the way that you think about language and titling, and how big a role that plays in your work. And, if you see language as another medium that you're using in addition to wood and apples and find other things.
Yeah, I mean, I think visually, like everything I do, I think of like the sculpture itself and everything I put into it is sort of like being part of that language. And so like every mark or gesture is like saying something about that topic or that idea. So like the pineapple tree, like it's grown to be more than this, but I mean, the original joke was I was walking through the woods and I was in Maine and I was with my dad, and you're not allowed to bait deer, but people still do illegally. And we're walking through the woods and there were just some apples that somebody had left under this pine tree. I looked at my dad and I was like, what are those? Innocent kid. And my dad, the very ask a stupid question, get a stupid answer, was like, it's a pineapple tree. And just kept walking, just left it at that, left it. It's like,
that's
what?
A great dad joke.
Just kept walking, straight face, kept going. I was like, what? Took me a second to catch up and run after him, but it's so it really made me laugh. And I've always like really liked that kind of like use and play of language and sort of like twisting things to kind of be like, wait a minute. And then in like the pineapple tree with like labor and stuff like that, there's like a secondary kind of like darker joke, I guess, that's kind of built into it that kind of moved away from that story, although it still has that idea of like, I mean, the origin of the joke for me in some ways still has a little bit of violence because like the apples were there to lure and kill something.
Yeah.
But when I was working on manipulating materials, like some of like a lot of the texture I put into it, like really subtly, I think maybe not subtly, but a lot of the texture I put on the wood, I mean, I did it with a hatchet over the course of like, I think it took like 10 minutes per foot for like, I did probably close to like 60 feet of just this like hatchet marking across all the woods with this barky texture. And then I think about like this, like the hidden labor and like everyday things, and like this sort of like violence that we don't really think about with like, you know, cutting down lumber. And like, even though it's really nice and pristine and smooth looking, I mean, that 2x4 has gone through a lot of crap to become a 2x4 and like just sort of like this being stripped down from this living thing. And then here I am taking a bunch of 2x4s and slapping them back together in this really crappy looking like caricature of a tree that like, it's, like there's just sort of this dark irony where like it was supposed to have some glorious purpose when it was cut down, and I've just smacked it back into a tree shape again. And be like, nah, you're a tree again. You're a pineapple tree this time, though.
Yeah, I think that's. I mean, I love hearing the story behind it. I think it adds to that kind of darker undertone that like you kind like after it sits with you for a little while, you start getting even just the like you said, like the idea of bringing 2x4s together, then building a tree out of the wood that's been, you know, been manufactured and processed with all these different chemicals and sealants and all that crap. It is a very human thing to do, and really interesting that way. And I think that brings me kind of, I think, to my two last questions. My first of the last questions is how, you know, you're talking about the textures in the work, and obviously I haven't been able to see these things in person. I'm really curious how you view people experiencing and interacting with them. You know, is this, you know, can people get up and touch these things? Is it, you know, is it just to be looked at? Is the white cube the ideal space for them? What is the yeah, so I get a little verbose sometimes on Zoom. What's the ideal experience like?
I'll start kind of backwards. Ultimately, I would love to see this, like, as this project expands, I'd love to see it in more of a domestic setting, like in an old house, you know, as opposed to a gallery, although gallery works fine for now. And I know there are some galleries that have been, you know, become galleries after something else, that have fireplaces and have a little more domestic look to them. So I'm interested in looking into, you know, those kind of spaces later. But as it kind of functions right now, I do want the viewer to get a sense of being in a domestic space. And I guess that's really the reason for making it a large installation. Not to, you know, not painters or anything, but it's a different experience than if I were to like try to paint my thoughts, you know, and put it, you know, an image that someone can stand in front of. It's different than having the viewer kind of enter that and experience it all around them. So I definitely want them to get that sense of the domestic. I want them to feel like they are in an environment, in a space that has this sense of uneasiness, that they're not really sure, you know, if they're supposed to feel comfortable or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think it leads into my, I'm going to stay with you for a little bit. And Josh, I want to hear your answer on both these questions. But then, like, you know, it leads me into that. My last question is kind of like where you see the work going now that we kind of at this culminating point. But obviously, as an artist, you know, you're going to keep on making work. You know, like, where do you see it going? Like, but also, like, when I think about a viewer experience, like, am I allowed to sit on the furniture? If you can expand this project to take over a house, are you painting on the walls and on the floor, or are they discrete objects that then sit in a domestic space? Like, I'm just kind of, I just want to hear what's going on in your head about that.
Yeah, no, I'm picturing like hardwood floors that are all black and white, like the painted, you know, black and white wood grain, and, you know, terrible floral wallpaper that's all painted black and white. No, I want to take it all the way. As for interaction with it, it's actually something I've been going back and forth in my head. You know, there's part of me that's like, yeah, I want people to be able, you know, to sit on the couch, to, you know, take their selfies and, you know, whatever else people do with interactive work. You know, on one hand, I think that could be really interesting. On the other hand, there's something interesting about having the viewer in that space and just looking at things and not being allowed to interact. It does add this sense of unease and this kind of wall. And also it is all white paint. So, you know, it's all, you know, once people start interacting with it, it's going to start turning gray and yellow. And I don't know. I keep going back and forth in my head which way I want to have it. But for right now in the gallery, it is set up so that it's not meant to be interacted with. But in the future, I don't know. I'm thinking about it.
Yeah. Hey, I mean, leaving it limbo could also fit with that, you know, fits with that tension.
Right.
If I don't know if I'm allowed to touch it or not, like, you know, you probably get one or two people who sit down and then get up real quick, you know. But yeah. So what about you, Josh? Where do you see how do you view people interacting with the work? Because also I feel like, I know you're both working at larger scales, but perhaps just the materiality of your work, Josh, feels a little bit more tactile, you know, in the sense of, I feel like I'd be less concerned about, like, you know, if no one was watching and I did want to touch it in the gallery, you know, if it was the white paint, then I was just like, I might be, you know, a little more hesitant. But yeah, how do you see the viewer interaction with your work, and where do you see these projects going? Is the pineapple tree a continuing project, or you?
Yeah, I could see it going a couple different ways. So like, yeah, I mean, if anybody wants to sneak a touch, you know, I mean, I'm not going to be upset, but I'm also not taking responsibility for any splinters and or other problems you have from touching it. I think, I don't know, there's something interesting about this latest iteration. I mean, I do have it on like a plinth and have like a little bit of a barriers, kind of like the separation, because it's a sort of like artificial. And I think I find it, I really wanted to see how it felt to like experiences like this separated, like elevated on like dad joke, essentially, like this really like, you know, just sort of like I think there's something interesting there about like elevating the pun and like being really important. But I do think that I guess right now I found it interesting, being that it's such an artificial thing that couldn't exist, to have it in like an artificial industrial kind of space. And like one thing I've also like, to play up the artificiality, I've got like a bunch of like fake apples and pine trees this time, as opposed to before. I was also having that olfactory part where like I smashed the apples and used like actual pine needles. And so like, I don't know how much time you spend like growing up, like watching the more they would rot, like the stronger and sweeter the smell would be. And so like it would smell better and better the more the thing died. I thought was really interesting to play with. And I think it might be interesting to like, after it's like served its purpose, living in this like artificial world, to like, what would happen if you reintroduced the pineapple tree back into the forest? Like if you just sort of like tried to return the tree to the trees and sort of like let it become. Yeah, I think I'm definitely more about the ideas than like necessarily retaining like this pristine object. So like, I don't, you know, if it became this thing that people wound up like walking over them like you would walk over any other tree or something like that, I'm definitely more about the idea of the thing than I am about, and like this like ephemeral thing that's like decomposing, as opposed to having this pristine thing that will look the exact same with every little like needle in the exact same place for the next, you know, however many decades. I would rather have it sort of function as this weird, like not living but almost living thing that had a life. So I'm more interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I like the idea of this work being able to have different registers. You know, if it's had actual apples and also plastic apples, and you know, so how did you make that decision in terms of what you were going to put in the thesis?
Well, in part, the gallery didn't want rotting food on the floor, so I was like, you know, that's fine. You know, I get it. Mice and bugs, that's an issue. When I cleaned up the first time, I accidentally left a bucket of apples and pine needles in my studio for too long before I brought it to the dumpster because it was snowing outside. And I got a nice, healthy lung full of fruit flies, which is not great. So like, I can't begrudge the gallery that one. That's, fair play. So for that reason, I moved a little bit away from it. But I think later, not wanting smells in this show being a group show, but like I think it might be fun to start playing with like a lot of like artificial smells too, and like really play up that artificial like thing that sort of like is just kind of constructed from a bunch of like everything was obviously like harvested from the real world in some way, but either chemically or through some other process has been turned into this artificial thing that's supposed to replicate reality without actually being real. Similarly, like with, and I think, pineapple is not the same thing as what I'm using pineapple for. And it's sort of just like everything is a little artificial and embellished in a way that's like this, like it references reality, but it's not at all. And I think like playing with that, like how artificial can it become while still being seen as like this like tree.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting. The idea of artificiality, I think is maybe a nice thing to wind this down on. I've been keeping a little timer, trying to make sure because obviously something that runs through both of your work and playing with that, and in terms of what we consider real and not, and even how we use those labels. Because I don't think anyone's mistaking your pineapple tree as an actual tree, but even when you say that, like I know exactly what you're talking about. So I mean, that's another kind of interesting parallels in your work. And I guess maybe my last question, like I'm just curious as to like how close your works are installed. Because I mean, when I looked at both of your images, I immediately was starting to get just house vibe, so it's just like, all right, we have the pineapple tree, that's like this weird Christmas tree in this house that is all whitewashed with the same pattern all over it, and it's creeping me out. But I'm just curious to like where if your works are installed near one another, and if you could put them near one another, would you?
So they're not near each other. They're actually not even in the same gallery. So my work is in the SU Art Museum on campus. Okay. And Josh, you are in CFAC, correct?
Community Folk Art Center, yeah.
I mean,
it could be.
Sorry, go ahead.
Interesting. I can see like the artificial house with the artificial trees out front and the artificial, like just like played up as this weird, like, I mean, it's like it looks like a reality, but like nothing that really is there could exist as like a thing. Like, nobody's gonna have like the uncolored with like just like coloring book outlined, house with like the fake trees out front. And I don't know, maybe somebody does. And if you're watching this interview, I'm sorry. not trying to throw shade at you. You live your best life.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's what's one of the, I won't say nice things, but I will say one of the new things with Zoom is that, like, I think especially as ours, we all have, I think, good mental ability, visual capability, just like putting your works in juxtaposition with one another. So even like my beginning question of why you wanted to do a joint interview, like it made sense to me, but I was just kind of curious as to why y'all wanted to. But I mean, like the last thing maybe that I kind of just wanted to get a little bit of your opinion on, which is kind of like the themes of psychology in your work, and kind of, is this something that you see? I know it's obviously hard to say, given that you're both young in your career, but is this kind of an examination of these, perhaps the way that we process memory and process events? Do you see that as a driving factor in your overall practice, not just in the bodies of work that you've been making over the last couple of years, but like, I know Katie said you had a undergrad degree in psychology. Is that something you see throughout all of your practice?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think I could ever get away from it. It was there. It was in my work prior to grad school, and I think it's just becoming more prominent. And I think it's really a big thing in my practice.
And I mean, and like quick follow-up, and I mean, not to be redundant for my question later, but is it more personal for you? Is it a way to, would you say it's a, I describe my practice as almost as like a method of digestion, a method of research and development. Would you say it's something similar for you? Like, so I don't know, once this project is completed, whenever you feel it's completed, do you feel like it's going to be like that same motivating drive, whatever topic it is that you go into next? Is art functioning in that way for you?
Yeah, I really do think it does. It does feel like sort of my own art therapy, but I guess unlike art therapy, I don't want it to happen, behind closed doors, and then lock it away. I want to put it out there. I want to share it. So there's that aspect to it. But yeah, it definitely has a very kind of personal function.
Yeah, I mean, I think both of you are doing some interesting slippages with something that's highly personal. You both have highly personal narratives in your work, but then, these interesting ways to kind of really quickly expand it, but then it gets hyper personal again. And I really like that kind of almost breathing that I get from both of your work. So yeah, Josh, I would love to kind of just hear, it seems like your process, I don't know if it's just the project that we're talking about, and I don't want to get too personal, but you're growing up, home life, and also your relationship with your parent or your dad. Is this something that also gets processed through your interest in labor? I'm not sure, obviously I don't know what your dad does for a living,
Yeah, there's always I don't know if I'd ever call it a therapy, but there's definitely when I'm done with something, there's a kind of catharsis where I know okay, this is what I wanted, whatever that is. I've hit the point where okay. I definitely, a lot of the decisions with the materials even, my dad's an IT guy currently. He's had a couple different careers, but just growing up in Maine, it's a very do-it-yourself kind of place, and growing up with God bless him, I love my dad, love my parents. He spent 20 years just on different projects, remodeling the house himself and doing all this hard labor and construction himself just to save some money and try and provide a better life for us, and just sort of a lot of love and respect for that. But there's definitely this kind of I feel like I'm going on a tangent if I do distancing. I don't remember what the original question is, but it's I definitely yeah, there's definitely a lot of as I'm doing this stuff, I'm starting to just how old I am. I'm hitting this age, the same age that he was when I was born. Yeah, I'm a couple years short of that, but it's starting to get to that point where that idea of who he was in my head of the guy that could work with construction materials and build all this stuff and do all these things and had all these skills that were not at all related to what he did as a career, and sort of working with similar materials and objects and starting to get to that same age. It's something that I don't know where that's going to finally find its end necessarily in my artwork, but it's definitely something that it was definitely a driving factor when I started referencing a lot of construction materials and a lot of labor within my work. It's kind of thinking about the labor that I grew up around and watching, and it was a daily basis of this grind to just kind of get done when it needed to be done. Yeah.
Okay, no, that makes sense. It was one of those questions I love ending off with a good, I think it's one of those questions, I think, especially when you're in this grad school environment, when you start doing this hand gesture, I was yeah, I want to know what that is. What is this for you? Which is a question that, I don't know, perhaps the work of being an artist is you spend your whole life figuring out what that is. I don't know. One of my professors had a really great quote that the work is what the problems are. That's something that always kind of stuck with me a little bit.